Hello. Today is Monday, May 11th. Welcome to episode 594 of Fault Lines, the National Security Institute's podcast that gets you quickly up to speed 3 times a week on the national security and foreign policy debate shaking up America. I'm NSI Advisory Board member Lester Munson. I'm joined today by senior fellows Morgan Vigna, Jess Jones, Matt Hayden, and Marc Raimondi. Folks, we're talking about the pending U.S.-China summit in Beijing between President Donald Trump and Chinese Supreme Communist leader Xi Jinping, which will happen on Thursday. Notably, China is many hours ahead of us. So that might be Wednesday here in Washington, at least in part. Our president is leaving tomorrow to go to China. The two leaders will visit the Temple of Heaven, which is evidently a real thing in Beijing. So that's probably good, right? Folks, the world's two most important leaders going to the Temple of Heaven. We're in favor of that. Obviously, there's a lot that these two leaders could discuss: national security issues, economic issues, other things affecting the people who live on planet Earth. The Trump administration has generally been messaging that good things could happen on the economic front. The president is traveling with several CEOs of major American corporations like Boeing, which is known to sell things to China. So there may be an economic message out of this. Of course, looming around all of this is the war in Iran, which directly impacts, of course, the United States, which started the war in Iran, and China, which generally gets a lot of energy resources from Iran. Morgan Vigna, let's go to you first. What do you think the stakes are here for the average person living on planet Earth in the meeting of these two great men?
Well, happy Monday, everyone. We got a full house here at Fault Lines. This visit by President Trump is the second that we've seen in a year. Of course, he met with Xi in the fall. The last time an American president met with Xi in China was actually President Trump in 2020. I am not expecting anything groundbreaking to occur during this summit. I think Trump largely wants to see progress, or at least the maintenance of trade and security issues, and a continuation of the discussion that the leaders had last fall. Obviously, I think the big game changer, Les, which you mentioned, is that we now have the war in Iran and shutting down the Strait of Hormuz. China obviously gets a ton of oil from the Strait of Hormuz. From Iran itself gets about 12 to 13% of its crude oil. And so China has a major stake here in trying to end this conflict. And I expect Xi will probably press President Trump to do so. Xi is also expected to try to search for a little bit of predictability from the American president. Good luck with that. And I think Xi will also sort of be looking for a reaffirmation of his sort of superhero power status. Did I say superhero? I meant superpower status.
Super villain
on the world stage. Obviously, the Strait of Hormuz has not helped with this. So China in particular, I think, is worried about the economy. Obviously, we have growing costs. Oil in particular is going to be a challenge for Xi. When it comes to, Les, your question and how this is going to affect Americans, it's a good question, right? I actually expect to see discussions on trade talks. Obviously, the United States, President Trump, this administration has really made an effort to onshore and shore up, our supply chains. China is going to make this very difficult to do so. So it's not going to necessarily happen overnight. But I definitely think it's something that this administration should be pushing for, whether it's supply chain, rare earth elements, and any of these sort of like critical components that go into, everything that Americans use on a daily basis.
Matt Hayden, newly shorn Matt Hayden, for those of you watching on the YouTube, boasting a pretty good haircut, it would appear, at least in 2 dimensions. Matt, what are the security implications here for the summit between Xi and Trump? Of course, China is, generally speaking, allied with Iran, Russia, Venezuela, Cuba, North Korea, the bad actors around the world, certainly in our perspective, and I would say objectively. What do you expect any developments on the national security front?
So the national security issues haven't changed. We just aren't hearing about them for this meeting. So cybersecurity, Indo-PACOM conflict, the tensions across the preparation for Taiwan, all of these elements are still very prevalent and candidly still being mitigated at both the U.S. and the Chinese areas. What we're seeing is for this meeting, that's going to be a topic for the margins. It's not going to be something that's going to be out front. It's not going to be something that's on the press. It's going to be seen as the United States talking about their strategies for working with the global countries across the Gulf states, as well as how they're looking at NATO and communicating the U.S.'s interest and hearing from China how they can be a part of that. And this is part of the way the president likes to look to people on the outside to support them being a part of that strategy. Now, it doesn't mean that there's going to be friendlies on one layer deep, because the Department of War, the national security engines that are running in the U.S. still have a very big China problem.
Marc Raimondi, if in fact security issues are pushed to the margins here, and this meeting is mostly about economic issues, is the author, or at least the named author of The Art of the Deal, the great business book from a couple of decades ago, is he going to get a deal that's good for the American consumer, the American economic actor here?
Well, Les, that's always the hope, right? And you are right. President Trump's 2017 book, Art of the Deal, sold over 1 million copies. Now, if President Xi, or frankly any of his predecessors, were to come out with a similar book, I think it should probably be called The Art of the Non-Deal, because they are masterful at it. And it's not because President Trump lacks leverage or deal-making ability. He has some really good cards to play, and he is pretty good at playing them. It's because the other side of the table, the Beijing side, has a long and very well-documented record of treating agreements as more like tactical pauses than binding agreements. So the right frame of mind, and I think one of my colleagues said this before, is if you don't expect much, you won't be disappointed for this summit. And I think that's the playbook that we're going to see. China's playbook is consistent and predictable. Pocket the concessions, slow roll implementation, restart endless dialogue, argue about the definition of definitions, and resist anything concrete, enforceable, or verifiable. We only need to look back to the president's first term for an example of this. It's the Phase 1 trade deal, where China agreed to buy roughly $200 billion more in American goods over 2020 and 2021 than they did in 2017. But according to the Peterson Institute, which analyzed the Phase 1 trade, China only bought 58% of what it committed to, and none of the $200 billion in exports agreed under the promise under the agreement. So the lesson is, don't not negotiate with China. But the lesson is, don't accept unenforceable promises and think you have a win. The same pattern shows up again and again and again. When China joined the WTO in 2001, many in Washington and around the world believed integration would push Beijing towards a more open, market-oriented system. It didn't. The opposite happened. China preserved and expanded its state-led mercantilist model, complete with industrial policy, massive subsidies, state-owned enterprises, opaque regulations, and non-market practices that continue to disadvantage foreign competitors today. Any enforcement of trade norms or agreements is nearly impossible given when China's system is opaque by design. If you can't see the subsidy, you can't measure the distortion. If you can't measure the distortion, you can't enforce against it. It's not a small technical problem. It's actually the heart of the problem, and it expands well past just trade deals. Let's look at the China Sea, which we mentioned on one of these podcasts a couple weeks ago. In 2015, President Xi stood right next to President Obama in the Rose Garden, or what used to be the Rose Garden, and said that China did not intend to pursue militarization of the Spratly Islands in the South China Sea. He lied. Not years later, in mere months, we saw military-grade airstrips, radar systems, weapons on these artificial islands that they just pledged not to militarize. So looking at today's lens, when Beijing asked for tariff relief, when they asked for semiconductor access, when they ask us to weaken our support of Taiwan, the question should not be, can we reach a deal? The question should be, what happens when China doesn't follow through on the deal we thought we had? What's the snapback? What's the verification mechanism? What are the penalties? Now, look, I'm not saying that we shouldn't have diplomacy. We have to, we're the two biggest economies in the world. But it's also not a given that a deal will be had. We've seen this president walk away from deals in the past where he thought were not good. He did it with North Korea, where he decided no deal was better than the wrong deal. And I also bet he hasn't forgotten about China's phase one failures either. So I think we have to talk to China. We have to negotiate. We have to play the cards we have. But we should not confuse dialogue with progress, confuse Chinese promises with performance. And we should think back to what President Reagan said regarding his dealings with the Soviet Union. He said, trust but verify. I don't think we should do that. I think we should drop the first part entirely. Don't trust, just verify. And make sure the verification has teeth, or we run the risk of being played again.
Jones.
I can't go after that.
Jones, no. Marc describes a supervillain. You are named after a supervillain fighter, Jessica Jones, hero of comic books, TV series, etc. How should we handle Xi Jinping?
Great question. Well, this story is very timely. I was just thinking at the end of last week, what happened to that summit? We had been waiting for it, earlier, a couple weeks, a month ago, and it got canceled, whether that was because of the start of the Iran conflict or they had not set an agenda and they didn't really know what they were going to talk about and no one was really prepared. We've been waiting for this to happen. But it kind of slipped by the headlines. It's not on the top page. Not many people are tracking it because I think, to everyone's point really here, folks don't really expect to see many major announcements, many major breakthroughs, right? And, it makes me think about the Trump administration. There's a lot going on in terms of diplomacy and deals. There's still Russia, Ukraine, there's Iran. We've got, the Board of Peace with Gaza. And I think the Trump administration seems very, cozy with and comfortable with kind of unresolved conflict, ceasefires that aren't really ceasefires as we have with Iran, kind of trade deals that are frozen and are kind of sitting in limbo. It seems, very comfortable in those gray areas because it gives the Trump administration some room for flexibility and leverage. But to Morgan's point, it leaves our partners and, those across the negotiating table not really sure, uncertain, right? Not sure what's going on, not sure that a deal is going to be made, that we're interested in a deal, who they're talking to. And so it's just another talk where I don't really anticipate we're going to see a major breakthrough. We just had the Chinese foreign minister meeting his Iranian counterpart. So as much as the president thinks he might get a friendly, help with Iran, with his personality, him and Xi are such comrades, and I say that intentionally, comrades, that Xi might give him a favor and help pressure Iran when it comes to the Strait. China doesn't seem, on pace to do that. It's spoken, earlier that they do want the Strait to be open, but that Iran has, Iran should be able to pursue, peaceful civilian nuclear program. So I don't think we're going to see major breakthrough there either. So as much as a superhero, I'd like to wave it, fix it, and we get a trade deal done. We got soybeans, we got beef, we got Taiwan settled. I don't think that's happening this week in May.
Folks, the Trump administration was signaling that it's got a lot of patience on Iran. There was an exchange of offers between Washington and Tehran in the last few days that didn't amount to much. The Trump administration is now trying to signal that we can wait out Iran. I actually think that's a very good thing in the president taking on the political pressure on his own shoulders. That's very bad for China, which can play a good short game here, but not a good medium long-term game. They need Iranian energy supplies. They need the Strait of Hormuz open as much as anyone does, probably more. So if the administration can play it cool, and not jump into any kind of crazy deal with the Iranians or the Chinese, I think that all moves to our benefit. The question is whether they're actually going to do that. All right, that's a wrap. Thanks to Grace Trice, Claude Jennings, the NSI staff, for the help in producing today's episode. Join us on Wednesday, May 13th, for another episode of Fault Lines, the National Security Institute's podcast that gets you smart fast on the national security and foreign policy debate shaking up America. Watch us on YouTube. Check out the hairstyles. They're pretty impressive today across the board. And we will see you next time.